Welcome to the last of our series on hotspots, cold facts about hotspots, and I hope you've all enjoyed the series as much as I have. I just want to bring to your attention that probably most, maybe all of you have received an evaluation form as you entered tonight. If you haven't, there are more up there. And we really take these comments of yours seriously, so we would appreciate it if you would fill it out. If you have a chance, you can drop it off on your way out. One of us will be up there. If you don't have the time to fill it out now, then it's just fold it over and you can mail it in, put a stamp on it and mail it in. Now, those of you who are returning students to our series know that we frequently have a handout about the upcoming series, or at least we tell you about what's going to come on, and that's what my purpose is tonight, to talk to you about the next semester's lecture series. We have a very special year for the Princeton Adult School. In 1939, this school was first formed, before World War II. And I had decided that it was appropriate to do something special for the upcoming 75th anniversary. So we on the board have dedicated the next two semesters, the fall of 2013 and the spring of 2014. And we will have many different things going on about town. And we would keep hoping that you folks will spread the word. Keep an eye open in the papers or more on our website and Facebook. We're trying to get more people into the digital communications with us. And we are really excited about next semester's upcoming lecture series. We have been helped by one of the great professors here at Princeton, who has contacted colleagues of his and explained to these colleagues that we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of our organization, and we would like for them to look at their own subjects of expertise and to talk to our group about the most important thing that has developed in their various fields over the course of those 75 years. We are in the process of getting the dates and all the names put together. That's why I don't have a written handout for you tonight. But we are very close to being able to fill up the whole semester. So keep an eye out for that. We will be contacting everybody, sending out our brochures, as we usually do, around Labor Day. And I think maybe on the 1st of September, but don't take this as gospel, but I think on the 1st of September we'll have all of the information up online. And then there are many other events that our committee of the 75th anniversary, which I've asked to have serve for us for this special time, they're putting together. So keep your eyes open and your ears open for the events that come along. And now it's my pleasure to ask Ann Seltzer, member of the board of the Princeton Adult School, to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Mark. It is a great honor to introduce the final session of the Princeton Adult School Lecture Series, Cold Facts About Hotspots. We started with Anne Marie Slaughter, and we end tonight with Ambassador Kurtzer. Great bookends to an important series of lectures. Daniel Kurtzer is the S. Daniel Abraham Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at the Woodrow Wilson School. During a 29-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, Dr. Kurtzer served as our ambassador to Egypt from 1997 to 2001 and the ambassador to Israel for 2001 to 2005. He retired in 2005 with the rank of career minister. Since leaving government service, Dr. Kurtzer has authored numerous articles on U.S. policy. I'm going to read you a few and note the one word that repeats in all of them. He's a co-author of Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, American Leadership in the Middle East, and The Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, and Pathways to Peace, America and the Arab-Israeli Conflict. He served as ambassador to the Iraq Study Group and currently serves on the Advisory Council of the American Bar Association's Middle East North Africa Rule of Law Initiative, as a member of the Board of Trustees at the American University in Cairo, and as a member of the New Jersey Israel Commission. He is on the editorial board of the Cairo Review of Global Affairs and Israel Studies Review. And on a personal note, beside giving me valuable insight into the world's troubled areas, this series has had, for me, another important side to it. We all get accustomed to seeing partisan wrangling and polarized discussions daily on the news. But when I've listened to the 8 intelligent, honorable, experienced experts speak about the world's hotspots, I've been reassured that we are in the hands of mature, extremely thoughtful experts who are taking a long view of our interests around the world. For that, I thank the Princeton Adult School, and especially tonight, Ambassador Kurtzer.
I want to thank the Adult School for the invitation to join you and to be the other bookend of your year-long study of cold facts about hotspots. Egypt, for many years, was considered to be a lukewarm spot because it seemed to persist in authoritarian politics that seemed never to change. In fact, I used to comment to the foreign correspondents who would come to the embassy when they arrived in country, and I would say to them, it's nice to see you now, and I'll see you when you leave, but you're not likely to spend much time in Egypt because the action always seemed to be someplace else. Well, for the last 2 years, the action has been in Egypt. And the place that we thought was fated to endemic and persistent authoritarian rule, to the unchanging nature of politics, to the persistence of corruption and crony capitalism in their economic system, is undergoing rather extraordinary change. Change that is, in fact, so unpredictable that almost from day to day we could have a session such as tonight and we'd be able to add new perspectives and new information on this situation. So in a sense, what we're doing tonight is stopping the clock for the next 45 minutes or an hour and to try to take a snapshot of a society not only in transition, but a society that is beset by different kinds of problems that so far don't seem amenable to easy resolution. And what I want to do is, in fact, take a look back in order to look forward, to provide a little bit of context for the Egyptian revolution, to try to understand who the main players are, what they represent, and to then see whether or not there are solutions that may be available to the issues that we will be discussing. If we do develop any solutions, I will be running to a phone because I can tell you they don't have them. I was in Washington earlier today at a panel about Egypt with the chief economist at the State Department, and I just saw one of my students in my workshop on economic change in the Middle East and said to them, the good news is that the subject matter that you're covering in this workshop is tremendously germane. And the bad news is it's more interesting than what I heard from the chief economist of the State Department. So we'll see whether or not we can develop any ideas tonight that may actually be actionable. I think it's important to start out by remembering that this is not simply a revolution in which there was a change in the presidency or even a change in the regime. But it's a revolution whose motto from day one was bread, freedom, and social justice. The Egyptian people, after nearly 60 years of, as I mentioned, this authoritarian control, what we call a Praetorian state, in other words, a state in which the military largely identifies itself as embodying the values of the state, but stands behind a ruler who until 2 years ago would come from the military and represent largely the military's interests. It was 2 years ago that people decided that that's not what they wanted in Egypt. And a combination of the end of fear, a combination of the beginning of a sense of national pride, and this idea that bread and freedom and social justice should be available to all Egyptians and not just a privileged few, led to what we saw on television, the Tahrir Square uprising and the subsequent dramatic events as President Mubarak left office to be replaced first by the military and then by a civilian government led by a Muslim Brotherhood candidate. So as we talk tonight, it's important to remember that this revolution is multifaceted. And to the extent that it either has or has not fulfilled the expectations of those who started the revolution will depend to a large degree, actually probably to an entire degree, to the extent to which the revolution can respond to these three major issues: providing food security, and effectively good jobs and a good economy for Egypt. The extent to which freedoms which had been denied for too long to the Egyptian people and to others in the region will expand. Freedoms that we take for granted in this country, but which in many countries of the world, including Egypt, have not been propagated. And third, the idea of social justice, that as the economy and as society expand, there will be equal opportunity and possibility of upward mobilization for people who until now had been largely cast into classes that prevented their becoming part of an upwardly mobile society. The second thing to bear in mind in terms of what might be called first principles about this revolution is that the issues that we're going to talk about revolve around some very deeply rooted political, cultural, psychological factors that are very challenging for outsiders to understand about Egypt. My wife and I, and at least in one of our incarnations there, our children have lived in Egypt for almost 8 years. Not just during the period when I served as ambassador, but my first overseas assignment in the Foreign Service was in Cairo. And yet after 8 years of living in the country, we have very good Egyptian friends. We are perhaps at the point where we can begin to ask the right questions, but I'm not sure we have any of the right answers. It is a very challenging society, largely opaque to outsiders. It's been compared to an onion where you peel back layers after layers and you never quite get to the core, or to a stage that has veils and drapes and curtains that as you pull one back, all you see is the next. Egyptians are very sensitive about their independence and about protecting their identity, and therefore, to the extent that we can understand the issues that motivate Egyptians, we'll perhaps have a little glimpse into what is a very difficult problem for policymakers to focus on. Let me start with the current situation and work backwards. You probably have seen in the newspaper that Egypt today is trying to grapple with two immediate challenges. Number one is a political challenge, whether or not the Muslim Brotherhood-led government, President Mohamed Morsi, representing the Freedom and Justice Party, can govern in a situation in which the population is split about 50-50 with respect to political preferences. Morsi's election last June revealed a split of about 51.2% and 49.8%. In other words, this is a badly divided society. And it's a society that not only is divided in broad terms between the supporters of Morsi and the supporters of his opponent, But even within the various sectors of society that comprise what we might call political factions or the beginning of political parties, there are layers upon layers of differences and difference of views and different organizational entities. For example, the Islamists are not unified. The Muslim Brotherhood is perhaps the largest component of the Islamist factor within society, but you also have the Salafists, a much more fundamentalist brand of Islam, quite determined to see an Islamic state in Egypt as soon as possible. Muslim Brotherhood may be prepared to compromise somewhat more. Even within the Muslim Brotherhood, there are debates about the scope and content of Islamic policy that the Freedom and Justice Party should advance. A younger generation of Muslim Brotherhood members actually wants to admit women into the Brotherhood. They'd have to change the name, of course, to become Brotherhood and Sisterhood. But it tells you that there are changes underway even within this fundamentalist segment of society. A second factor in Egyptian politics, of course, remains the military. Military took over after President Mubarak left the country in February of 2011, mismanaged the political system for about a year and a quarter, and then was easily convinced that it was time to return to the barracks. But returning to the barracks for the military does not mean leaving politics, because the military wants to ensure, number one, that it retains the primary role in determining national security policy, in particular, the decision-making with regard to whether or not Egypt goes to war under any circumstances. And secondly, the military wants to protect economic equities that it had built up over time. Scholars who have estimated the degree to which the military has pervaded the Egyptian economy understand that it could range as high as 40% of Egypt's economy is controlled by military industries, military businesses, not just those that manufacture guns and bullets, but travel agencies, agriculture and food manufacturing. They put together cars for the Egyptian population as well as jeeps for the military. So this military may have retreated to the barracks, at least ostensibly, but is very carefully watching what's going on in the centers of power in Cairo to ensure that its role in determining Egypt's national security interests and power and its own perks with respect to the economy are safeguarded. The third force within the society are those who are part of what may be called the deeply embedded security establishment. Now you remember in Tahrir, the military positioned itself in a sense between the security forces and the demonstrators, and adopted for itself the position as a kind of arbiter of the national identity. And for that, it was appreciated by the masses who had assembled in Tahrir Square, because they felt that the military had understood the nature of this popular revolution and was not part of the coercive mechanisms of society. The fact is, however, there are coercive mechanisms in Egypt. The Interior Ministry, the Mukhabarats, the Internal Security Police have been those who have had to carry out the dirty work of an authoritarian regime. It's not just that freedoms are suppressed in authoritarianism. They are suppressed forcefully and violently at times. And there is still in Egypt a large cohort of people, armed and trained, who represent this deeply embedded security establishment. And they're not a happy group of campers. Their minister, Habib al-Adli, was sentenced to life in prison for the role that security forces played in putting down the Tahrir uprising. Many of the top chiefs, although exonerated by the courts, have been nervous that at some point their turn will come. And it may be a matter of time until these security forces decide that their own interests need to predominate over the interests of the state. And therefore, even though you don't see much of them in the day-to-day politics of Egypt, they are a large force hovering over these day-to-day politics. A fourth element are what might be called former regime elements. not necessarily the security side of the regime, but there was a large mobilized group of people called the National Democratic Party. This was the government's party. It was established throughout the country, based in Cairo, but it had branch units in every town and village in Egypt. And as in all authoritarian parties, its job was to make sure that the government's program was popularly supported. Meaning when it was important to bring the masses out to demonstrate in favor of the government, that's what they did. When it was important to make sure that people either stayed home or went to the polls, that's what they did. And now they're disenfranchised. Now they're seen as part of the old problem, but there's a lot of these people. And the question, as with every great revolution in history, is whether or not they will constitute the core of a counter-revolution at some point. Until now, they haven't, but they're there, and we don't know what will happen with them. And finally, one might suggest that a fifth element or factor within society is what's being called in the press the opposition. Now that suggests that there's some kind of a unity of purpose or unity of organization within this group. The answer is not. Opposition in Egypt is terribly fragmented, so much so that if you count the election results in the first round of presidential voting, had the opposition been unified and had the opposition put forward a candidate, that person would be president of Egypt then. Because the opposition would have scored more votes than Mohamed Morsi and would not have required, would have gotten over the threshold of 50% and not required a runoff election. But you had 6 or 7 opposition candidates running for president. You have 6 or 7, sometimes even more factions that constitute themselves as an opposition. They have created recently something called the National Salvation Front, which sounds as though they're beginning to organize themselves, but they really haven't. So you do have an opposition, but it's an incoherent and unorganized, disorganized, a group of different political factions, none of which has been able to find an organizational or political center of gravity around which to present an alternative vision for Egyptian society. So the first big challenge today is governing. And what Mohamed Morsi has found is that it's not easy to be an underground Islamic group in Cairo, but it may be actually harder to govern this country. He has faced up to and so far overcome challenges with respect to the military. He has faced up to and so far overcome a challenge over the drafting of the Constitution. He is now facing a challenge with respect to the scheduling and implementation of parliamentary elections. And he is facing his biggest challenge, which is the second big area of current concern, and that is how to manage an economy that essentially has already gone over the cliff. And it's been compared, do you remember the cartoons where the character would be running fast and run off the cliff, and as long as the character kept churning his legs, everything was fine until he looked down? Well, if the Egyptians look down, they will realize that their economy doesn't exist to the extent that it did before the revolution. They have drawn down their foreign exchange to a point where they can cover required imports of wheat and fuel, not luxury goods, not consumer goods. Wheat and fuel they can cover for less than 3 months, which is a crisis in a country that is about to enter Ramadan in about 3 months. They are right now in a situation where worker demands for increased wages without increased productivity have essentially shut down factories. And so whatever they were manufacturing is now reduced by, the latest estimate I heard today was between 17 and 20%. Egypt is what's called a rentier state. In other words, a large part of their income derives from activities in which they don't really produce anything, but they earn rent from the export of natural gas, tourism, Suez Canal revenues, and remittances. And all of them are down for different reasons. Suez Canal revenues have been down for several years because of the world financial and global trade situation. Tourism is down because of the lack of certainty and security in the country. Natural gas should not be down, except you recall right after the revolution, terrorists attacked the gas pipeline connecting Egypt with Israel and Egypt with Jordan. And other consumers of Egyptian gas decided this was not a certain supplier. And so Egypt Gas is no longer a gas of choice for many of its former customers. And this becomes a huge crisis for a government that not only faces a challenge of an opposition that is trying to unseat it, but facing challenges of a type that even in the good times before the revolution would have been daunting to an authoritarian ruler. So today, if we just take a snapshot of the situation in Egypt today, it's a country in tremendous crisis, which is getting bailed out on a day-to-day basis through essentially handouts. Just the other day, the state of Qatar handed the Egyptians, or promised the Egyptians, a check for, I think it was $3 or $4 billion. The second such occasion in which the Qataris have bailed out Egypt when Egypt has been in need of foreign exchange. But for how long can Egypt rely upon this muddling through policy? What one hears in Cairo, I was there about 3 weeks ago, was the idea that we, Egypt, are too important for the world to let us fail. Well, this may have been the case 15 years ago when we were all flush, and the United States might have come up with more resources, and Europe might have come up with more resources. But we are not flush anymore. And there are strong indications that Congress may in fact impose conditionality on our assistance, our existing assistance to Egypt, that may in fact have us not even delivering what we have delivered over the past 30 years, let alone thinking about increasing. So if there's an approach or a policy that suggests that Egypt could muddle through this crisis, it may be short-sighted enough to be almost suicidal. Now, how did Egypt get into this situation? And what preceded the revolution that none of us foresaw? We knew the problems. I say this with very mixed views. We understood those problems, and you can now know that by reading WikiLeaks. Now, I hate WikiLeaks because the idea of the confidentiality of diplomatic reporting is critical to diplomacy. But it does give you a window into what our embassies in this region were reporting over the years. And you can now read that our embassies, our ambassadors, and our officers understood very well that they were dealing with societies that were largely dysfunctional, that had not resolved long-standing historical problems with relationship to succession or their own legitimacy, that maintained authoritarian, autocratic rule as a substitute for advancing freedoms, for opening up their societies, that had become a nesting ground for corrupt, crony capitalist policies, which were misleading in some respects. If you look at Egyptian figures before the revolution, the economy looked like it was booming, growing at 7, 8, 9% a year. And yet the maldistribution of economic benefits largely accounted for that motto of social justice. Because at the same time that people were subsisting over an income of maybe $100 a month, there were lavish weddings in Cairo costing $300,000 or $400,000, and Mercedes running through town, pushing people off the streets. So the maldistribution of wealth and the income disparities before the revolution were extraordinarily deep and wide. And yet Egypt was a country in which the United States found a very strong strategic partner. And this accounts for the uncertainty of American policy as the revolution unfolded. You look back 30 years, a little over 30 years, when the U.S.-Egyptian relationship really took off in the late 1970s. And there were 3 goals that the United States basically decided for itself in forming this strategic relationship with Egypt. Number 1 was to try to cement the peace treaty that President Anwar Sadat and Prime Minister Menachem Begin had signed in 1979. For those 2 countries, and for the United States, this was a cosmic breakthrough. Because the saying in the Middle East is that you don't make war in the Middle East without Egypt. And Egypt, having taken itself out of the Arab-Israeli conflict into the Arab-Israeli peace camp, had essentially meant that there could be wars, but they would not be of the intensity or of the kind that had occurred previously when you had major interstate engagements. In fact, if you look back to the period before and after 1979, since 1973, in fact, there has been no war involving the State of Israel and a major Arab state actor. The various wars and engagements that we've seen have all involved Israel and non-state actors. The PLO, Hamas, Hezbollah. Now sometimes those wars have engaged Arab state involvement after they've started. But you can see the centrality of Egypt in this issue by the fact that Arab states no longer had the capability of their own to think about engaging in war with the State of Israel. So for the United States, the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty in 1979 was a critically important issue, and that became one of the three cornerstones of our policy vis-a-vis Egypt. The second cornerstone was to see what we could do to wean Egypt off of its reliance upon Soviet weapons, doctrine, and training. Remember, this is the height of the Cold War, 1979, 1980. Egypt had been a client of the Soviet Union ever since the mid-1950s. And for the United States, this was a zero-sum game. Either you were with the United States camp, or you were with the camp of the Soviet Union. And so there was an opportunity that presented itself in the late 1970s to move Egypt from column B into column A. And in fact, this has largely succeeded. The United States has poured a substantial amount of assistance into Egypt, but we have created a situation in which Egypt is now largely a military force based on American doctrine, using American weapons, and employing American training. The first test of this proposition, of the second pillar of our policy, came, as you recall, in the Gulf War, in the first Gulf War in 1991, when two Egyptian divisions fought alongside the international coalition to move Iraq out of Kuwait. Now the reality is, and we know that Egypt didn't fight very well, but the reality also is that they were interoperable with our forces. They occupied an important place in our lines, and their presence in the international coalition played an instrumental role in ensuring that this was not seen as a Western neo-colonial exercise. This was a coalition of those who wanted to turn back aggression, and it included the United States, others from the international community, and key Arab states, including Egypt, and I might note, including Syria as well. So the second pillar of our policy, in a sense creating a military ally in Egypt, has succeeded. And it has not only succeeded in terms of the transition of the Egyptian military itself. Think about the following. We've had, whether we like it as individuals or not, we've had our military mobilized and deployed in the Middle East for the last 12 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. Every soldier, every piece of equipment that we have sent to the arena of conflict has gone through Egypt or over Egypt or has stopped in Egypt for repairs or whatever. We use Egypt not as a base. They're very sensitive to thinking of themselves as an American base. But they facilitate the transit of our ships through the Suez Canal. They have to do so by treaty, but they don't have to give us precedence. And they certainly don't have to give us precedence for nuclear-powered warships, which they do. They facilitate the transit of all of our airplanes, and all of our equipment, and all of our personnel. And so if you had a general up here instead of a former diplomat, that general would tell you that the cost, the savings of the cost that we would have to spend if we wanted to deploy that same number of people and same amount of equipment is enormous. The difference in cost and time is enormous. So the second pillar of the policy, creating a military ally that provides benefits not just to Egypt, but also to us, also succeeded. And we thought that the third pillar of the policy had also succeeded. When we developed this relationship with Egypt in the late 1970s, early 1980s, I was stationed in Egypt at the time. And we saw it, we knew it. Egypt was largely a broken country. We lived, in fact, at the time about 10 miles south of Cairo in a suburb of Cairo called Maadi. It's a large diplomatic community and other Westerners. When I left the house in the morning, it was the last time I could communicate with my wife because the telephone system didn't work. We knew there were going to be blackouts every day because the electricity system in Egypt didn't work. Buildings in Cairo would collapse because of water and wastewater problems. So you had a country that was largely broken with respect to its infrastructure and largely broke with respect to its treasury. And you look back to the period of the last decade, Egypt's infrastructure, while getting old now, has improved to a point where when we put out an international tender in 2004 for a new telecommunications network infrastructure in Iraq, an Egyptian company won that tender. Egypt, for a while, was exporting electricity to Jordan and around the Mediterranean electric network, which has been developing over the past couple of decades. So its infrastructure, its water, wastewater, utilities, telecommunications infrastructure, largely modernized with our assistance. But Egypt became a functioning economy. In mid-1990s, the International Monetary Fund, which currently is negotiating with Egypt with respect to a potential $4.8 billion loan, negotiated at that time a macroeconomic structural reform program, which the IMF declared to be the most successful in its entire history. And what that led to was the growth of the Egyptian private sector. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the growth of that private sector was also accompanied by problems, by corruption and cronyism. But the fact is that the Egyptian economy transformed itself over this period, with serious business people taking on economic policy and fixing things that had seemed unfixable. So the three pillars of American policy over the past 30 years actually have played themselves out relatively well. And so it happened when the revolution took place in 2011 that you found an American administration beset by indecision. Because on the one hand, the question of stability of an ally, of a friend, of an anchor of a peace treaty was being called into question. And on the other hand, the possibility of actually seeing a democratic transformation in the making was before our very eyes. I once described the day-to-day unfolding of policy of the Obama administration during this period as trying to watch a very volatile stock market, not only from week to week, but from hour to hour. Because you would see a line that consistently moved back and forth between stability at one end and promotion of democracy at the other. We would argue for gradual change, and we would argue for dramatic and transformational change, often the same day, often in the same statement. And it represented the double set of ideas that motivated and motivates American policy. So the backdrop to what's happened over these past 2 years, and the backdrop is we create a context or set of context that goes back 30 years, does leave us with a conclusion that this is a seriously complex set of problems. The question was posed today at the panel that I was on in Washington. You may know David Ignatius of the Washington Post. He was the moderator of the panel. And he stumped us with the following question. The question was, against this backdrop of U.S.-Egyptian relations, and looking forward at the prospect of an Egypt that may transform itself into something resembling a democracy, is it in the United States' interest to support the government of Mohamed Morsi, an Islamist government, or to maybe let that government fail in the hope that a successor government would not be Islamist? How do you answer that question? Now, the answer I gave, which we can discuss in the course of the question and answer period, is the fear that I have over what I described earlier as the counter-revolution. The other shoe that hasn't yet dropped. Round, whatever, 5 of what's likely to be a 15-rounder. Because we're not further than round 5 in this revolution. The concern about a political revolution turning into a social revolution, in which masses of people unhappy because they can't get bread at affordable prices, and they're not getting jobs that are any better than what they had before, and there isn't the social justice that brought them out on the streets, does drive them out on the streets again to a point where they consume even the forces at work within society that are governing, however poorly they're governing. And so the fear, not of instability per se, but of chaos, becomes an additional factor in the American calculation. So why should we care about Egypt? Why does this matter to us? Well, it matters to us because many of the same factors that impelled us to throw our weight behind Egypt 35 years ago are still with us. The anchor of Egypt in securing the possibility of an expanded peace in the Middle East is still as important in 2013 as it was in 1979. We may not be closer to the comprehensive peace. So far, it's given me 3 books. The way things are going, I'm going to get a few more out of the absence of peace. But the fact is that we can pursue that peace process as long as Egypt and Israel are at peace. And if there is one day when the Egyptian society, when the Egyptian military and political system decide that it is in their interest to go to war with Israel, no more books. No more possibility of a comprehensive peace zone. That alone would suggest to the United States that it's in our interest to help Egypt. But it's also in our interest for larger regional purposes. We've tended to call these changes in the Arab world, different names: the Arab Spring, the Arab Awakening, the Arab transitions. And the fact is that there is still a great deal of uncertainty as to the direction of change, even in the countries where change has begun, but also in countries where we have not yet seen change, but it may be impending. One of the most interesting phenomena in the Middle East is the fact that of the 8 monarchies, except for Bahrain, there has been almost no internal dissent. And so academics are scrambling, trying to figure out, what does this mean? Are monarchies somehow more legitimate? Do they have more stability? Are they able to withstand these internal pressures better? Or are we simply seeing a delayed phenomenon, where in a couple of years, we're going to see challenges to the Saudi monarchy, or the Gulf monarchies, or Jordan, or Morocco? The changes underway in Tunisia and Yemen are even less certain than the changes underway in Egypt. And of course, the problems in Syria, upwards of 75,000 people being killed in a civil war that looks like it doesn't have an end, and also does not have a solution that we can help arrive at. So Egypt's important in this respect because the success of Egypt may help, not guarantee, but may give a helping hand to successful transformations elsewhere and successful transitions elsewhere. And the failure of Egypt may make a persuasive case for the autocrats and the despots and the tyrants to believe that in the end they can prevail. So we have a stake. We have a stake in peace. We have a stake in stability. We have a stake in a relationship that has been of benefit to us almost as much as it has been a benefit to Egypt. And it's for that reason that we spend our time this evening thinking about these cold facts that relate to a very hot spot. Thank you very much.
why didn't the Army do more to Mubarak in power? And the second question, why, under the current administration, why doesn't the Army do more to control the Bedouins in Sinai?
The first question is quite interesting because we knew from about 2000, right around the time that I left Egypt, 2001, that the Army was increasingly unhappy with Mubarak for one very specific reason, and that was the prospect of Mubarak's son Gamal succeeding him to the presidency. Now, Egypt may be a lot of things that are good and a lot of things that are bad, but what the military said to Mubarak early on in the last decade is that they were not an hereditary republic. There's a phrase that combines those two terms in Arabic, a gamlukiya, a republic and a monarchy. In fact, the Egyptians laughed loudest when Assad in Syria was succeeded by his son. So when the prospect of Gamal Mubarak becoming president after his father retired and passed from the scene started to become serious, the military, we believe, went to Mubarak and said, we won't allow this. And yet Mubarak never took it off the agenda. And so there was an increasing distance between the military establishment from which Mubarak had come and which he had largely shaped. You're in power for 30 years, you're appointing the top generals and the top commanders. But there was a growing distance between that establishment and Mubarak. So that now fast forward the clock to January 2011, and in the first days of the uprising, when Mubarak would not rule out the possibility either of running for another term, or would not rule out the possibility, at least at the beginning of the uprising, of having his son compete in the election, the military decided they had enough. There's an argument made that it's made in places like Saudi Arabia and also in Israel, strange bedfellows in this case, but also among the Egyptian opposition, that somehow the United States engineered Mubarak's departure, and that's just wrong. We were always 24 hours behind the military in making decisions about what we preferred in the 2011 uprising. So ultimately, we also reached the conclusion, we, the United States, also reached the conclusion that Mubarak needed to first announce that he wasn't going to run again, and then ultimately to leave power. But this was 24 to 48 hours after the military had already made that clear to Mubarak in Cairo. On the second question, you touch on the issue of how the military sees its role and what dirty work it's prepared to do. Until the revolution, the security situation in Sinai was a police matter. Police were deployed, internal security forces were deployed. The military was deployed in parts of Sinai in accordance with the peace treaty, but largely to deal with interstate, cross-border problems, and would only be thought to be called in if a crisis arrived of such proportions that the internal security forces couldn't handle it. So the military is not anxious to do essentially police work. And having said that, they're also concerned about the fact that the police are not doing their work. And so you do have this vacuum in Sinai, and there's a debate in Egypt about whether or not at some point the Egyptian military will be asked to clean up Sinai, and how they'll respond when they are asked to clean up Sinai. In the meantime, a vacuum has been created, and it's quite serious a security situation. Let's go up on top there.
How much of the instability do you attribute to having elections before there was a constitution?
It's a good question. It was a point of major debate within Egyptian society. Many people argued it made no sense to have an election for leaders who didn't know what kind of system they would be walking into to lead. On the other hand, the majority of Egyptians, because there was a referendum on this issue, made a decision that they were anxious to change the old constitution and divest it of all remnants of Mubarakism, that that they could possibly find. And so there was a very quick fix to the Constitution back in the spring of 2011. That was put to a referendum and it was adopted. The elections then followed. Now you have a new Constitution that was adopted with a referendum that supported it, that will form the basis for parliamentary elections. So the question is a good one. The Egyptian people, in their wisdom or lack of wisdom, made the decision largely to go for the Constitution first before going for elections. We might have done it differently. So,
why does Egypt seem to dislike the Gaza tunnels, perhaps even more than Israel does, to the extent of filling them with raw sewage? And what are the implications of this, if any, for relations with Hamas and this situation in Palestine?
isn't that a great irony that Israel withdraws from Gaza in 2005 and the Mubarak government does nothing about the tunnels. The Islamist government comes into power in 2012 and does start to flood the tunnels with raw sewage, disrupting Hamas's income, basically, and smuggling routes. I think the simple answer, nothing is simple, but if I were to give a simple answer, it's connected to the previous question, or one of the previous questions. It has to do with security in Sinai. The government in Egypt has become very concerned that tunnels work in two directions. Not only are things being smuggled into Gaza, but things were being smuggled out of Gaza into Sinai, and people were coming out of Gaza into Sinai to attack Israel from Egyptian territory. You recall, I can't remember the time frame, maybe 6, 8, 10 months ago, there was a lethal attack from Sinai in the Eilat area, the southern part of Israel, which a number of Israelis were killed riding on a bus, and Israel responded by firing into Sinai, killing some of the perpetrators and apparently some Egyptian policemen. And that's the kind of incident that can mushroom immediately into a real crisis. So even if there is a sense of camaraderie and brotherhood between the Brotherhood in Egypt and Hamas, the security of Egypt was now being called into question by from an area that Hamas governed, and that was intolerable. This is probably an issue, if we had access to Egyptian decision-making, this is probably an issue that was decided by the military and not by the Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood needed to go along with it because of the compelling nature of the argument.
What is the role of the judiciary in Egypt, and what is the nature of the relationship between the Egyptian government and Israel?
Two questions, the role of the judiciary and the relationship between the Morsi government and Israel. The Egyptian judiciary has prided itself since the 1952 revolution for being about as independent as any sector of society could be in that Praetorian state. In fact, if you go back to the 1970s, there was something called the massacre of the judiciary when Sadat tried to fire the most senior Egyptian judges who were too independent, and they were not following the orders of the government. So the judiciary in Egypt not only prides itself, but has had a long history of an independent streak. Now that said, the situation since the revolution has been of two different sorts. On the one hand, the judiciary is acting as an independent force within government. They are pursuing prosecutions, they are investigating corruption, they are doing what you would expect a judicial system to do. And on the other hand, there are too many anecdotes which suggest that there is truth to the idea that they have also been influenced by the street. So if popular demonstrations are calling for the arrest of business person X, next thing you know, business person X gets arrested, gets thrown in jail, and the key gets lost for a long period of time. So there is now a kind of mixed picture of the Egyptian judiciary. On one hand, potentially as an independent factor in what we would see as a normal allocation of power among three branches of government, hopefully an independent judiciary, but some indication that the judiciary may be a bit too swayed by the populism of the revolution and maybe losing some of that independence. So the jury, if I can say so, is still out on this question. On the relationship with Israel, I'm not looking for another invitation to come back, but it is the subject of at least its own full lecture. So maybe the year after next. Because next year you have this very interesting program of the past 75 years of change. If you had asked anyone in Israel and those who follow Israeli-Arab relations in Washington what to expect from a Morsi-led government, they would have rolled their eyes and been very nervous a year ago, a year and a half ago. The concern was that even if the military was making ultimate decisions about war and peace, the day-to-day bilateral relationship was only going to head downhill. And it would manifest itself in a variety of ways, in the absence of visits, the absence of any kind of coordination on matters that affected the two countries, an Egyptian role in international organizations against Israel. And you could have predicted a number of ways in which the two countries would have grown further apart, even if the treaty had remained intact. Well, it didn't quite happen that way. And several examples. We just talked about the flooding of the tunnels. I used to tell people when I was ambassador, when they were demanding that Egypt do more to curb the tunnel traffic, when I was there, Israel was in control of Gaza, and I said, well, why can't you control the tunnel traffic? There was always somebody else to blame for the failure to deal with the tunnels. And now who's dealing with the tunnels? It's the Morsi government. Even if it's the military that made the decision, it's the Morsi government. When Israel and Hamas went to war in November, who negotiated the ceasefire? To Israel's benefit as well as Hamas's benefit. It was the Morsi government. So Egypt under Morsi is doing things that are totally unexpected with relationship to Israel, even though there is absolutely no warmth in the relationship. I don't even think Morsi has said the word Israel since he came to power. He talks about our neighbors and our treaty partners or whatever it is. So there's no love lost here. But in terms of the to-do side of his government, he's done what nobody would have expected, which is not just maintain a treaty, but actually accomplish some purposes that have advanced Egyptian-Israeli relations, notwithstanding himself, which is, I think, quite interesting.
I'd like to ask you about our $1.2 billion aid to the Egyptian military. What we're getting for our money, why we're doing it, when our own infrastructure is crumbling here, and isn't this aid to prop up their military actually working against us on the Arab Street?
Working against?
Working against the reputation of the United States on the Arab Street.
Let me put the question into context first, and then I will answer. President Obama just put together his foreign affairs budget, his entire foreign affairs budget, which covers all of our foreign assistance, all of our contributions to not just bilateral assistance, but multilateral organizations, and all of our foreign operations under the rubric of the State Department, and accounts for about 1% of the federal budget. That's the entire overseas commitments of the United States. So of that, would I like to have $1.3 billion? Sure, we all would. But in the context of what we do overseas, which is minuscule anyway, this is not a large component, number one. Number two, having said that, and at the risk of repeating myself, although you didn't hear me today, I made this argument in Washington. I would not necessarily argue for a diminution of our assistance, our military assistance to Egypt, but we're giving them the wrong stuff. They don't need hardware anymore. We're giving them airplanes and tanks. If you look at Egypt's own national security agenda, their questions relate to instability in Libya, which requires vigilance along a very long border in the desert, very challenging to secure their Egypt's western border. It involves water resources emanating from Sudan that start deep in Africa. You know, the Blue Nile and the White Nile meet at Khartoum. You've got at least 9 other riparian states dealing with the lifeline of Egypt, the Nile River. And you have an Ethiopia which has become much more aggressive in promoting its water interests relative to what it used to do. Egypt, under the terms of a 1959 treaty with Sudan, believes it's entitled to 55% of the Nile water. Ethiopia says, well, hold on a second, I'm an upper riparian, and you left essentially nothing for us because Sudan took the other 45%. And Ethiopia is now building large dams and hydroelectric power plants. So their second national strategic issue is, are they going to be in a position to protect their lifeline? Third, Sinai. You're not going to deal with the instability and insecurity in Sinai with F-16s and M1A1 tanks. You're going to deal with it with sophisticated police and counter-insurgency, counter-terrorism tactics and equipment. So the argument I would make is we are delivering aid like we delivered it over the past 30 years without thinking through the implications of whether or not Egypt's needs have changed. Now, one of the reasons we're doing that is because the Egyptian military believes that it needs to have prestigious equipment in order to be seen as a potent military force. And I would just like to see us test that proposition. So I think we may differ on the question of the amount of aid, but we certainly don't differ in terms of the content of aid when it comes to the military.
You mentioned a little earlier that we might be forced to impose conditions on our aid. What sort of conditions would those be, given what you've just been talking about?
Well, there are several initiatives in Congress that would establish benchmarks or metrics for democratic governance that, in a sense, would then trigger the delivery of aid. So if Egypt undertook a reform program for, I don't know, its bureaucracy or for rule of law, they would then be eligible to get X amount of their assistance. Or if civil society organizations were permitted to operate under a reasonable law, they would get Y amount of their assistance. And those are the kinds of, they're essentially political conditions or metrics that would trigger the release of aid. The problem with those metrics, of course, is not that they're inherently bad. If you want to see good behavior and it is your own money, why wouldn't you ask the recipient to do the things that are healthy for the recipient? The problem is that we have not yet reached agreement on whether these are the right things to be done. We think they are, but the Egyptians may have a very different view about what their priorities are. And if the aid then becomes subject to this major difference over priorities, it doesn't get delivered, and then that cliff that Egypt is going over only gets more problematic. So it is a very mixed picture with respect to conditionality. I don't know how it's going to come out. It's actually a live issue now in Congress.
The Egyptian economy now, which is almost non-existent, is there any policies around Washington or the EU or somewhere else to have a more strategic policy to rescue Egypt and get the economy back to be a functioning economy? Because if we don't do that, I think we're going to have very dire consequences.
Well, this is one of the core issues that I was trying to talk about this evening. And the problem with trying to develop an answer in the United States is we don't have the money. If there's concern about the amount of money we're currently diverting to foreign assistance is not popular anywhere in this country. And we heard, the argument of, our bridges are collapsing and our railroads. Why does it take 2.5 hours to take a train to Washington? It should take 55 minutes. Our infrastructure also needs fixing, so you don't get a lot of support for dumping money into another country, even if it's an important country. And that becomes the large factor here. It's the issue I tried to address of Egypt's belief that, in fact, when they do look down, having run off the edge of the cliff, someone will provide a safety net for them. And I don't know if that's going to be the case. When Qatar decides they put enough money in, when the Saudis decide they put enough money in, I don't think we're putting more money in. I don't think the EU is going to put more money in. So you really are at a stage here of the proverbial game of chicken. The Egyptians assuming that they're going to get rescued, and the rest of the world trying to convince them that the rescue won't come from us. And there's no easy answer to that dilemma.
Is there an individual in the Egyptian military who might be identified as individual to be drafted? Should there be a collapse of the political system?
Well, if there were, I would not out him here. Because that would be the kiss of death for that gentleman.
Is it a possibility?
Look, there's a very strong undercurrent of support in Egypt for exactly that to happen. I was actually in Egypt twice in the last 3 months, and friends and people literally on the street would come over and kind of shake me and say, tell the military to take over and straighten this thing out. Now, nobody in Egypt wants Mubarakism. Mubarak's not coming back, but they don't want Mubarakism to come back. But they would like, a large part of that population would like the military to come in and kind of get things back in order, then go back to the barracks, and then some smart leader, stays behind, puts on a suit instead of a uniform, and everybody's happy. Does that person exist? Would the suit who had been a uniform actually be a Democrat, a small D Democrat? Who knows?
But it's not beyond the realm of possibility.
It's not beyond the realm of possibility. I would just refer you, however, we were in Egypt in 1981 when Sadat was assassinated. Mubarak took over. People assumed that this guy was okay. He looked a little weak, looked like a transitional figure, and 30 years later, he was still a transitional figure. So, that may not be the panacea for the problem.
You had implied that Ramadan was going to be some kind of a big turning point in the next few months. Why is that?
In preparation for Ramadan, the Ministry of Supply in Egypt stocks up an amazing amount of food. Because Ramadan is a period of 30 days of fasting during the day, and then there's a prodigious amount of food that gets consumed at night. And since it's not a normal eating pattern, whatever the normal supply provisions have been change in preparation for Ramadan. If, as we believe, Egypt's usable foreign exchange is down to under 3 months coverage, and if you need to prepare additional food and fuel supplies for Ramadan, you're not going to have it. And the question is, where are you going to get the food for people to celebrate their religious holiday? It could be, I don't like to make predictions, but if in fact there is a food crisis in Ramadan, that could be the precipitant or the catalyst for what I said earlier was the social revolution. I don't think Egyptians will put up with that kind of government incompetence. So that's why I mentioned the Ramadan issue.
What
It's a great question, and it's one that the Chinese will not answer. Because they're very happy right now to be in a position where they're seen as kind of good guys. They don't bother anybody with demands for reform. They don't have metrics for democratic governance. They go in and they buy stuff and they sell stuff. They have a long-term contract for oil and gas with Iran, so they don't want to bother Iran. They just want to buy their oil and their gas. They sell things in the Middle East. They don't want to bother Egypt or anybody else with giving advice or taking responsibility. So the answer is, and I'm trying not to be too cynical, although I am cynical about this, the Chinese are not yet ready for prime time when it comes to exercising the role of a great power. They are a great power when it comes to all of the economic measuring rods, but they don't play as a great power because their very narrow economic interests trump everything else in the way they do their business overseas. So where's China in all of this? They're not ready. They provide a little bit of assistance, they build a few things, they are seen as kind of, good guys because they don't bother anybody, but they're not coming in with billions of dollars to bail out Egypt at the end of the day.
How can Egypt turn its economy around?
Yeah, well, this was, remember earlier I said if we had any good ideas? So that's the question, and nobody has a simple answer to it. The answer to the question will always start out by saying you have to undertake a long-term plan and you have to be willing to live with it even as you modify it as you go along. Because Egypt was a long-term problem even when the economy was functioning. And they've now been set back years as a result of these past 2 years of the way they run the economy. So just to get back to where they were in 2010, it's going to take them a while. And one of the things the IMF and the donor community is saying is the only way you can start to get back to where you were is to bite the bullet on the IMF reform package. That opens the door to not just $4.8 billion of loans and financing from the IMF, but it opens the door to what's estimated at about $14 billion from the rest of the international community. That then gives Egypt the cushion as it undertakes reforms. For example, on subsidies. Egypt, 25% of the Egyptian budget is used to subsidize basic food commodities and fuel. Now, nobody would argue to lift subsidies tomorrow because the poor in Egypt need those subsidies. But the subsidies are not targeted. So who benefits from fuel subsidies? Rich people, because they have big cars and they go to the gas station every 3 or 4 days. Poor people don't have cars, so they don't really benefit from a subsidy that is designed to benefit them. So these are reforms that Egypt should be able to implement. But as long as they don't want to implement, they cast them as cosmic problems. Lift subsidies, the poor people will starve. So that's the way to start. You've got to bite the bullet on the IMF program. You get the safety net of the international assistance. You start to implement the reforms, and you plod along over time. Things will get better. We saw it over the last decade before the revolution, when growth rates were increasing every year. And there weren't enough jobs, but jobs were being created. And the Egyptian population is educated and smart, and they can do it, but it's not a quick fix. It's a many-year program. And how many politicians want to launch a many-year program when they don't know if they're going to be in office next year? And that's part of the problem.
One last question, please.
Way in the back.
You mentioned that you were in Cairo 2 weeks ago. Were you able to get a sense of what's happening among the young people in Egypt?
Well, the young people are largely hanging around because they're largely unemployed. The unemployment numbers of young, educated Egyptians are frightening. I can't remember the exact numbers, but if the unemployment in Egypt is 13 to 18%, young educated unemployment is about 40%. So you go to university, you get your education, the education may not be that great, but then you can't get a job. You can't get a job because there aren't enough jobs, and you can't get a job because you were trained in a system that was not gearing the training for what the job market requires. Now, you may have heard of the introduction, I'm on the board of the American University in Cairo. Our graduates are getting jobs because the university, it's not the best university in the world, but it's the best university in Egypt. So employers will turn to AUC for graduates, even if the graduates are not coming out with exactly the skills they want, because they understand that these are smart kids who can learn. But you go to Cairo University, a university was built for a maximum of 25,000 students. There are 140,000 students. There are students who never go to class because they can't fit. There are doctors who never get into a laboratory, part of their training. And it's really quite extraordinary, and they can't get jobs even though they're holding a BA. I'm not sure you'd want some of them to have jobs in some of the professions, but there aren't enough jobs because the job market is smart, and they know that these graduates don't have the skills and the training that's required. So, you know, among the many things that have to get done in this plodding exercise is you've got to revamp an education system which is also broken. I'll tell you one last anecdote on this. In 1998, right after I arrived in Cairo, I called in my aid director and said, show me the measurements or the metrics by which we can assess success in our aid program. And he said, okay, I'll get that to you, because he didn't have them. It took a couple of months, and we had a meeting, and he shows me in a number of areas some quite significant successes, infrastructure, for example. Education, at that time, this was 20 years into our program, we had provided $750 million to Egyptian education. And there was not one metric that showed any sign of progress. So I went to the Minister of Education. I didn't even consult Washington, which was uncharacteristically bold. I just went to the Minister of Education and I said, I'm not giving you any more money until you come up with a reform program. Boom, all hell broke loose. How can you dictate to me? We're a sovereign country. I said, well, I can't dictate to you, but I can decide not to give you my money. And I'm not going to give you my money unless you undertake a reform program that I'm not going to dictate. It has to be your reform program. So you come up with a reform program and I'll start the funds flowing again. It took 6 months and we got a reform program out of him, but it was so modest that I'm sure if I went back today and asked for the same metrics, we would be right back where we were 10 years ago. Not much success. Thank you very much.